Can you imagine what it would be like to discover something so spectacularly ancient and groundbreaking that nobody's ever seen it before? Well, the people on today's list couldn't wait for that, so they simply decided to come up with their own. Some of these hoaxes were petty pranks that snowballed. Others were carefully planned fake discoveries that fooled scholars, museums, and even governments for years. From fake apes to fake relics, fake cities, and even fake civilizations, I'm Mike with List 25, and these are the 25 biggest ancient discovery hoaxes in history. 25. Loys ape. Loys ape became a serious topic in the world of science thanks to a single photograph and an interesting backstory. The photo, taken during a failed oil expedition in the early 1900s, seemed to show a large, tailless ape sitting upright in the South American jungle. There was no skeleton, and no one could confirm the animal's size. The only evidence of its existence was one picture and the claim that the animal was much taller than any known monkey in the region. But that was enough for some researchers to speculate about an undiscovered hominid and even promote it as evidence of our so-called missing evolutionary link. Skeptics soon noticed the red flags. The animal looked just like a spider monkey, a species common to the area. The photo also didn't show anything to judge its size, and some of the later versions of the picture were edited to make the ape seem bigger. People who knew Loys later said that the monkey's tail had been cut off and that the animal was posed on a box. It ended up on display in several museum collections for years, surviving on trust and prestige, while the evidence fell apart. 24. The Father Pat Noise Memorial Plaque. In the mid-2000s, a bronze memorial plaque appeared on Dublin's O'Connell Bridge honoring a man named Father Pat Noise, who was said to be an advisor to Padre Clancy and who supposedly died in a suspicious carriage accident in 1919. The plaque looked official and used the right wording. It even named the group that put it up. For almost 2 years, people passed by without noticing anything odd, since it fit right in with the city's real memorials. But when journalists and historians looked into it, they found out that there was no such priest. The name was actually a joke, and the group mentioned on the plaque didn't exist either. Dublin City Council later confirmed that it was a hoax, but by then the locals had already grown fond of it and it had become part of the city's character. In the end, the city decided to leave the plaque where it was. 23. The Newark Holy Stones. In the 1860s, carved stones with Hebrew writing began appearing at the Newark earthworks in Ohio. If they were genuine, these stones would have meant that ancient Israelites reached North America before the Europeans, connecting biblical history to America. Different groups grabbed onto the stones immediately. Some claimed that they proved ancient Masonic builders existed. Others treated them as confirmation of religious scripture. One bishop even used them to support the idea that all humans came from a single origin, which was important both politically and morally at the time. Eventually, archaeologists and linguists worked together to compare the stones' inscriptions with real Hebrew examples. They found the stones mixed writing styles that were never used together. Today, most experts agree that the stones were made locally in the mid-1800s, not in ancient times. 22. The Venus de Brizet. In 1937, a white marble statue was found in a turnip field near Saint-Just-sur-Loire, France. It was missing both arms, its lower legs, and part of its nose. Art historians looked at photos of the find and said that it was a Roman copy of a Greek original from around the 2nd century CE. Within months, it was being discussed almost everywhere. Visitors paid to see it, and it was officially classified as a historical monument by the French government less than a year later. But the story took a turn when the well-known sculptor Francesco Cremonese admitted he had made the statue himself just a year before, using Carrara marble and a live model. He also showed photos of the statue as he worked on it and proved how the broken pieces fit together. The Venus de Brizet went from celebrated ancient artifact to confirmed modern forgery in less than 2 years. 21. High Brazil. High Brazil is probably one of the longest-running discoveries that never existed. Starting in the 14th century, European maps showed a round island west of Ireland, named for a mythical Irish high king. It was drawn so consistently that it looked as real as any port or headland, and that was enough to launch expeditions to it from Bristol in the late 1400s. But nobody ever found it. Scholars later suggested that the sailors of old may have mistaken fog banks, far-off coastlines, or even the shallow Porcupine Bank for an island. and by the late 1800s, navigators had mapped the area well enough that High Brazil was dropped and no longer appeared on any credible maps. 20. Percy Fawcett's Lost City of Zed. In the early 1900s, British explorer Percy Fawcett became obsessed with the Lost City of Zed, a label he used for a mysterious civilization he believed once thrived in Brazil. That obsession intensified after he encountered a 10-inch basalt figurine he thought supported his theory. The figurine came from novelist H. Rider Haggard, who claimed it was Brazilian and connected it to a lost city. Fawcett took the find to the British Museum, but the experts there could not identify it either, and suggested it might be a fake. Instead of dropping it, he then took it to a psychic who claimed to see a drowned continent between Africa and South America, and a line of priests guarding the idol for a promised reincarnated leader. Fawcett took all of this seriously. In 1925, he carried the idol into the Brazilian jungle on his final expedition. Neither he, his son, nor his son's friend were ever seen again. 19. Mississippi's Dummy Mummy. Mississippi once proudly showed off what it believed was a genuine Egyptian mummy, complete with a reputation as a princess. The figure came with an artifact collection bought in the 1920s and quickly became the star of the old state capitol displays. Kids lined up to stare into its red-lined coffin, and families treated it as a strange little claim to fame. When plans for the Old Capitol History Museum took shape in the late 50s, curators decided to move the mummy to a back room, since it wasn't actually tied to local history, and that's where it stayed until the big reveal in 1969 when Gentry Yeatman, a medical student with an interest in archaeology, x-rayed it. Instead of human bones, he found a wooden framework held together with nails, stuffed with animal ribs, and wrapped in papier-mâché made from German newsprint and an 1898 Milwaukee newspaper, which suggests it was probably made in the late 1800s. No one has ever proved exactly who built it. 18. The forged Dutch Stone Age tools. Tjerk Vermenning started out as a respected amateur in the Netherlands, collecting prehistoric tools from plowed fields and working with the Drents Museum. His big leap came in 1965 when he announced a cluster of Neanderthal-era flint tools at Ugersmild, then found more at Heiken and Emster. The pieces were presented as roughly 50,000 years old, the first major Neanderthal sites in the northern Netherlands, and they completely rewrote the region's prehistory. Vermenning was paid for his collections, received prizes and a yearly stipend, and newspapers cast him as a working-class discoverer who outshone the academics. As more specialists examined the material, however, they started to flag the tool's sharp edges, inconsistent patina, and patterns that seemed to come from modern grinding work. A decade later, in 1975, a study declared the key pieces forgeries, leading to Vermenning's arrest and a fraud conviction in 1977. 17. The Iruña-Veleia scandal. In 2006, Spanish archaeologist Eliseo Gil announced sensational finds from the Roman site of Iruña-Veleia, near Vitoria in the Basque Country. Scratched onto 3rd century pottery, he said, were one of the earliest images of the crucifixion, Egyptian hieroglyphs, and Basque works that pushed the written language back by about 600 years. For a short time, it sounded like the site would be rewriting our textbooks. Then a panel of experts started looking closely. Some pieces referred to non-existent gods and to René Descartes. Others spelt the god Jupiter with a J, a letter Latin did not use. There were also reports of fresh tool marks and the discovery of modern glue on the pottery. After a long investigation, a court in 2020 ruled that many of the inscriptions were modern additions. Basque police later described the case as one of the biggest manipulations of Roman archaeological material ever uncovered in Europe, both in the number of objects involved and the way they were fed into museums and official reports. And both Gil and collaborator Ruben Cerdan were convicted, fined, and sent to prison. 16. The Cueva de los Tallos gold hoax. Cueva de los Tallos, located in the Ecuadorian rainforest, became famous not because of archaeological discoveries, but because of what an explorer claimed was hidden inside. In the 1960s, Hungarian-Argentinian adventurer János Juan Moritz claimed that a secret chamber in the cave contained a golden library of metal books covered in ancient writing, as well as piles of gold and unusual sculptures. Erich von Däniken later repeated and expanded on this story in his 1973 book Gold of the Gods, presenting it as proof of a lost civilization helped by extraterrestrials. That was enough to trigger a massive 1976 expedition led by Stan Hall, supported by the Ecuadorian and British governments, and joined by former astronaut Neil Armstrong. The team carefully mapped the cave system in detail and documented a real prehistoric tomb with ceramics, but there was no golden library, no metal books, and no advanced underground city. 15. The Kensington runestone. In 1898, Swedish immigrant farmer Olof Oman said he pulled a 200-pound runestone out of the roots of a tree on his land near Kensington, Minnesota. The inscription, written in runes, tells a dramatic story of 8 Geats and 22 Norwegians on an exploration journey from Vinland in 1362, finding 10 of their men red with blood and dead, and asking the Virgin Mary for protection. Now, for anyone who wants Vikings in the American interior, it sounds perfect. The problem is that the language and the runes fit the late 1800s much better than the 1300s. The text uses forms that look more like modern Swedish, mixes rune shapes that had already disappeared with ones that only show up again in the 18th and 19th centuries, and just so happens to look exactly like some of the examples that appear in a schoolbook on runes that Oman owned. Most modern researchers see it as nothing more than a local Scandinavian community hoax that grew into a much bigger legend. 14. The Hercules at Gibraltar sarcophagus. When a carved sarcophagus turned up at a quarry at Tarragona in 1850, Buenaventura Hernandez y Sanahuya seized on it as proof that Egypt and Spain were linked from the very beginning. One panel showed Hercules opening the Strait of Gibraltar while colonists and animals streamed west from a landscape filled with crocodiles and palms. Hernandez published it in 1855 as an Ibero-Egyptian monument, and claimed it confirmed legends about Egyptian colonists in Iberia. Outside Spain, experts quickly rejected the piece as a clumsy modern invention, known against stiff figures, fantasy animals, and made-up hieroglyphs. Hernandez even destroyed most copies of his own book later in life. But, funnily enough, nearly 60 years later, a surviving end fragment fooled A.L. Frothingham, who reused it in a 1916 American Journal of Archaeology article, until French scholar Pierre Paris very publicly reconnected it to the bogus sarcophagus in 1921. 13. Hesenge's Roman inscription claims. Andre de Hesenge was a 16th century Dominican humanist from Évora who loved Rome enough to start improving its history on paper. In several of his works, he published Roman inscriptions that conveniently proved things he wanted to be true, including the idea that the general Quintus Centurius lived in Évora and even built its great aqueduct. That changed in the 19th century when epigrapher Emil Hubner went through Hesende's material for the Corpus Inscriptionum Latinarum and flagged at least one key Sertorius inscription as false. Modern studies went even further and proved that other Évora inscriptions were fabrications too. Today, Hesenge is still known as an important Portuguese humanist, but epigraphers now think of him as one of the biggest 16th century forgers of Latin inscriptions, rather than a trustworthy source on Roman Portugal. 12. The Persian mummy. In 2000, police in Pakistan raided a house near the Iran-Afghanistan border and came out with what looked like a once-in-a-lifetime discovery. Inside a stone sarcophagus lay a mummified woman in a gilded coffin, wearing a gold mask and crown with a plaque that read, "I am Rodongoni, daughter of the great King Xerxes." Officials proudly announced the first ever Persian royal mummy, dated to around 600 BCE, and Iran and Pakistan immediately began arguing over who owned her. Then, science rolled in. CT scans and x-rays showed intact tendons, recent decomposition fungus on the face, and mummification that copied Egyptian style badly. The wooden coffin is dated to only a few centuries ago, not 2,600 years. And forensic work later concluded that the body was a modern woman, about 21 to 25 years old, who probably died violently in the mid-90s and was then processed for sale on the antiquities black market for roughly $11 million. 11. The 17th century Etruscan hoax. In the 1630s, a teenage nobleman from Volterra thought Etruscan history could use some excitement, so he decided to do something about it. Curzio Ingrahami said he found wax and resin capsules filled with ancient writings, which he called scarith. Inside were hundreds of texts that he claimed were written around 62 BCE by an Etruscan priest in training named Prosperus Thessalanus. These texts supposedly recorded secret Etruscan knowledge from the earliest days of Italy to the fall of Etruria. Scholars all over Europe debated the discovery, and soon confirmed that the Etruscan writing went in the wrong direction. The Latin included lowercase letters with dotted I's that weren't used in ancient times, and that the style sounded a lot like Church Latin. By the early 1640s, critics proved that the entire collection was fake, even though Inkarami would never admit it. 10. The Heavener Runestone. The Heavener Runestone has all the elements of a great story. It's a massive stone covered in runes, hidden in the woods of Oklahoma. According to local legend, Vikings sailed up the rivers as early as 600 or 800 CE, carved Glomedal or Glom's Valley to claim the land, and then disappeared. But the evidence doesn't match the legend. The runes on the stone come from different alphabets. Some were outdated by the 14th century, while others are found in modern rune guides. Archaeologists also say there's no sign of Norse activity in the area, but there are clear records of Scandinavian settlers from the 1800s who were known to enjoy Viking revival symbols. Today, the consensus is that it's a late 19th century carving by a Scandinavian immigrant, not a Viking message. 9. The Michigan Relics. In 1890, a sign painter named James Ossuary was digging a fence post in central Michigan when he said he turned up a little clay cup covered in strange markings. Within a few years, he and his associate, former Michigan Secretary of State Daniel Soper, were finding thousands of tablets, copper plates, and stone artifacts in burial mounds across the state. The pieces showed biblical scenes and Near Eastern style writing and were eagerly promoted as proof that ancient Israelites or other Old World peoples had settled in Michigan. The pieces showed biblical scenes and Near Eastern style writing and were eagerly promoted as proof that ancient Israelites or other Old World peoples had settled Michigan. Experts in Near Eastern archaeology took one look and called them clumsy forgeries. Later work showed modern tool marks and fresh surfaces on the copper, confirming they were recent creations. The hoax still did real harm, though, because it encouraged people to loot genuine Native American mounds while chasing for more of these relics. 8. The James Ossuary. This small limestone bone box surfaced on the Jerusalem Antiquities Market in the mid-1970s, with Aramaic inscription that reads, James, son of Joseph, brother of Jesus. It stayed in a private collection for decades, and only made it to the public eye in 2002 when it was formally presented as a major biblical artifact. In 2003, the Israel Antiquities Authority examined the box and concluded that while the ossuary itself was ancient, the inscription had been tampered with, and Brother of Jesus was most likely added in modern times using fake patina to make it look old. That finding triggered a major forgery case against the collector Oded Golan, who was accused of being tied to a whole network of Bible-era fakes. After nearly a decade in court, Golan was acquitted of all forgery charges in 2012, but the judge made a point of saying that the ruling did not prove that the inscription was authentic. 7. The Pariba Phoenician inscription. In the 1870s, Brazil's National Museum got a drawing of a stone that was said to have been found near the Pariba River. The stone showed a long text that looked like it was written in Phoenician script. According to the translation, a group of Sidonian sailors left the Red Sea during the reign of King Hiram, hugged the coast of Africa, were blown off course, and ended up shipwrecked in Brazil, where a survivor named Metu Astare took possession of the land. At first, it seemed like the perfect evidence for ancient transatlantic contact, but the facts were flimsy. No one ever saw the original stone, and the person who claimed to have found it disappeared. Experts in ancient writing showed that the inscription mixed letter styles from different times and even copied words from a famous Punic passage in a Roman play. Ladislao Neto, who first supported the find, later called it a fake, and today, most experts agree, although a few fringe writers still use it as proof that the Phoenicians reached South America. 6. Hobby Lobby's Dead Sea Scrolls. When a museum removes a whole gallery without much notice, it usually means something serious happened. That's what took place in Washington, D.C., when the Museum of the Bible revealed that all 16 of its Dead Sea Scroll fragments were actually fakes. Experts hired by the museum used 3D microscopes, elemental analysis, and microchemical tests. They discovered modern ink on old leather, probably cut from ancient sandals or scraps, and treated with glue to mimic the shiny surface that real scrolls develop over centuries. All of these fragments came from the market after 2002, part of a group of items without clear origins that experts had warned about for years. Collectors spent large sums to buy these new pieces of the Bible, and the museum ended up as the most well-known victim. 5. The Bat Creek Stone. The infamous stone story really started in 1889, when Smithsonian field assistant John Emmer dug into a small burial mound near Knoxville, Tennessee, and reported a palm-sized stone tablet lying under a skull. His bosses decided the inscription must be Cherokee, which fit the narrative they wanted about local native history, and the piece went into the official federal report on mounds. Decades later, the economist J. Houston McCullough argued that the letters were actually ancient Hebrew and claimed that they proved sailors from the eastern Mediterranean had reached the Tennessee Valley. That claim did not survive closer scrutiny. In 2004, archaeologists traced the inscription to a drawing in an 1870 Masonic reference book and showed that Emmert almost certainly copied it before discovering the stone in his trench. 4. The Baigong Pipes. The Baigong pipes first came to the world's attention when a Chinese science magazine ran a short piece in the early 2000s about odd tube-shaped formations near Mount Baigong in Qinghai province. A group of hikers discovered them years earlier, but that small mention turned into a much larger story once the foreign newspaper started picking it up, and the story was that these tubes were not natural at all. Writers actually suggested that they were the remains of a forgotten civilization, and some even went so far as to say that it showed signs of alien engineering. What the crowds never saw was the lab work that pointed in a far less glamorous direction. The samples showed naturally formed iron materials, organic compounds, and sediments built up over long periods of groundwater flow. The tubes had not been shaped, fitted, or placed. They were simply part of the landscape. So the only human element in the story ended up being the tourists lining up for photos. 3. The Koso artifact. Few out-of-place artifacts get as much mileage as the Koso artifact, mostly because it lines up perfectly with what some groups hope to find. Creationist writers wanted a relic that didn't fit the fossil record. Alternative history fans wanted a hint of forgotten technology, and UFO enthusiasts wanted any excuse to drag spacecraft into the timeline. This one object managed to feed all three. The discovery happened during a casual geode hunt in 1961. 3 collectors found a rock in the desert near Olancha. When they cut it open, they found metal parts arranged around a ceramic core inside. It looked far too engineered to have formed underground, so the crazy theories took over. Years later, spark plug collectors compared the available images and x-rays to their catalogs and found an instant match. It was a 1920s champion plug that had been trapped inside an old concretion, not something from ancient times. 2. The Acámbaro figures. Okay, before I touch on this one, let me say this. Out of all the supposed ancient discoveries out there, this is the one people genuinely wanted to believe. Dinosaurs and humans in the same story is the kind of thing that's fascinating, whether you like fringe archaeology or not. The original source for the discovery of the figurines in the 40s was a local shopkeeper who said that he stumbled onto a huge stash of clay pieces near Acámbaro. More and more of the tiny human figures, animals, and things that looked a lot like dinosaurs kept turning up, making the discovery even more impressive. But that would also be his downfall. The volume of the tiny animals kept growing. So the specialists started looking at the circumstances around the finds, and it simply couldn't hold up under their scrutiny. The figurine surfaces showed tampering patterns that didn't match the shopkeeper's story, and no independent digs produced anything similar. Dig teams then tested the surrounding soil and found nothing that matched the material. Every authenticated batch ended up being traced directly to the same shopkeeper. 1. Shinichi Fujimura. Archaeology holds a special place in Japan. New digs make national news, and big discoveries become part of the country's cultural identity. That's why Shinichi Fujimura rose so fast. He was an amateur with a talent for finding Paleolithic tools much older than any found before in Japan. Every site he worked on appeared to push the timeline back by tens of thousands of years, and his finds became the backbone of early Japanese prehistory. It was simply too good to be true. So, journalists, acting on tips from skeptical archaeologists, set up a sting and one day filmed Fujimura planting artifacts at a site before sunrise. Later that same day, he announced those objects as major breakthroughs. When they confronted him with the footage, he apologized and tried to limit the damage by claiming that only a few of his finds were planted. But re-excavations proved otherwise. The fallout reached every corner of the field. It was so severe that Japan's entire scientific timeline had to be taken apart and built again. Fujimura eventually admitted that almost every major discovery that he had ever claimed was fabricated. He was expelled from the Japanese Archaeological Association, resigned from the Tohoku Paleolithic Institute, and would forever be known as the centerpiece of Japan's biggest archaeology scandal. And that wraps it up. If this one kept you entertained, go ahead and hit like and subscribe so YouTube knows you want more. We've got a fresh list waiting for you every day. But if you want to switch gears and look at discoveries that were absolutely real and far more intense, our related video is 25 most intense archaeological discoveries in human history. Some of these finds are simply unbelievable. It'll be the perfect follow-up. The link to that one will pop up right here in just a few minutes. And as always, thank you guys so much for watching. Have a fabulous day, evening, or afternoon, depending on where you are in the world when you're watching this. And I'll catch you again next time.